We all know Panem, the capital, the districts, the Hunger Games. We know the rules, the arenas, the punishments, and the rebellion that would one day challenge the capital's authority. But there is a deeper question that rarely gets asked. A question that sits beneath the games, beneath the districts, and beneath the capital itself. What kind of world allows something like Panem to exist in the first place? I'm not talking about how the games were created, or who ruled. I'm asking what happened before any of it was possible. Before Panem was born, the world had already ended. Not in a single explosion, not in one final day, but slowly, quietly, and then all at once. There is no official record of how our modern world collapsed. The capital never offered a complete explanation, and that absence alone tells us something important. Whatever happened was too chaotic, too complex, or maybe just too inconvenient to preserve in full. What we do know is that modern civilization did not simply fall overnight. It unraveled over time. Systems failed. Governments weakened. Trust dissolved. Major cities disappeared from relevance. Places like Washington, D.C., New York, Berlin, and countless others likely fell into disorder long before they vanished from memory. Infrastructure broke down. Supply chains collapsed. Power grids failed. And once those systems were gone, survival became local, desperate, and unequal. It's unlikely that nuclear war alone caused this collapse. The land that would later become the districts was still habitable. Crops grew, people lived. Entire regions were not poisoned by radiation for centuries, as you would expect after a full-scale nuclear devastation. Instead, the end of the world was probably driven by something far more familiar and far more terrifying: environmental collapse, rising sea levels, melting ice caps, extreme weather, food shortages, and the slow, agonizing failure of global cooperation. The maps of Panem show a continent that is smaller than modern North America. Vast coastal regions are simply gone. This suggests flooding on a massive scale. Entire cities and low-lying areas were likely swallowed by the ocean, erased not just physically, but politically and historically. As the world became more and more unstable, power stopped flowing outward from governments and began concentrating inward toward places that could still offer safety. And one of those places was deep within the Rocky Mountains. High elevation, natural barriers, far from the rising oceans, protected by terrain rather than diplomacy. Long before the final collapse, it is very likely that emergency facilities were constructed there. Government bunkers, military installations, research shelters, places designed not for comfort but for continuity. These shelters may have contained medicine, preserved seeds, weapons, energy systems, and most importantly, knowledge. Records of the old world, science, engineering, history. While the surface world struggled, these pockets endured. When the outside world finally fractured beyond repair, the people with access to these shelters survived. Generals, scientists, politicians, industrial leaders, tech elites. Not because they were stronger, but because they were prepared. At first, these groups were probably isolated. Separate bunkers, separate command structures, limited communication. But survival has a way of forcing cooperation. As years passed and supplies diminished, smaller shelters would have sought contact with larger, more stable ones. Slowly, a central hub emerged. What would later become the capital did not begin as a city of excess. It began as a place of coordination, a meeting point for knowledge, technology, and authority. Those who gathered there likely believed they were preserving civilization, not ruling it. They saw themselves as the last hope. In the early years, there were not enough people or resources to rebuild the world as it once was. Advanced technology may have existed in storage experimental energy systems, early genetic research, even prototype aircraft, but without labor, infrastructure, and raw materials, this technology remained dormant, a ghost of a forgotten age. Meanwhile, outside the mountains, survivors were forming their own communities. Scattered settlements, small groups clustered around whatever resources remained. Fertile land, coal deposits, forests, waterways. These people were not thinking about power or politics. They were thinking about survival, about making it to the next day. At first, these communities were independent. But independence is fragile when resources are limited. Over time, they needed medicine, tools, fuel, knowledge, and the only place that still had those things in meaningful quantities was the growing power in the mountains. The relationship began out of necessity. The emerging capital provided aid. In return, it received raw materials, food, labor, energy. At this stage, the arrangement may have seemed fair, even generous. The capital offered stability in a world that had none. And in a world of chaos, stability is the most valuable currency of all. But stability always has a cost. As the capital grew stronger, it began to organize production. Certain regions were encouraged, or maybe pressured, to focus on specific resources. Farming here, mining there, lumber elsewhere. What began as coordination slowly became specialization, and specialization became dependence. The more the outer communities relied on the capital for medicine, tools, and protection, the more control the capital gained. This didn't happen through force, not at first. It happened through systems, through logistics, through planning. It didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, over time, step by step. By the time people realized how much power they had surrendered, the system was already in place. The trap had been set and sprung without a sound. The capital now had something no one else did: order, while the rest of the continent struggled with instability, disease, and scarcity. The capital functioned, it planned, it stored, it expanded, and because of that, more and more communities sought its protection, its stability. They traded freedom for security, piece by piece. What began as a network of survivors cooperating to rebuild was transforming into a hierarchy. And hierarchy, once it becomes normalized, rarely disappears. At some point, the capital stopped seeing itself as one survivor among many and began to see itself as the center, the authority, the final decision-maker. The districts were no longer partners. They were components, each one defined by what it produced, not by who lived there, not by their culture, not by their identity, but by their usefulness to the capital. District 12 was coal. District 7 was lumber. District 4 was fishing. People became resources. The old world had ended not with a bang of fire, but with the quiet whisper of forgetting. Forgetting what freedom looked like. Forgetting what choice felt like. Forgetting that systems are created by people and can be changed by them. By the time Panem truly came into existence, a nation built on this rigid, brutal system, most people no longer remembered a world without it. It was simply the way things were, the way they had always been. And that is where the real story, the one we all know, begins. By the time Panem was officially defined, resistance was no longer a realistic option. It wasn't because people agreed with the system, but because they no longer knew how to imagine anything else. The districts were isolated by design. Travel was restricted. Communication was limited. All information flowed in one direction only. Most people had no idea how many other districts existed, where they were, or what conditions they lived under. Each community experienced its own suffering in isolation, believing it was unique, unavoidable, and permanent. And that's the key. Isolation is one of the most effective tools of control. Without shared knowledge, there could be no shared anger. Without shared anger, there could be no organized resistance. The capital didn't need to crush rebellions. It stopped them from ever forming in the first place. Over time, the system hardened. What had once been a loose network of dependent regions became a rigid, unyielding structure. Each district was assigned a single purpose. District 12, mining; District 11, agriculture; District 4, fishing. Nothing more, nothing less. This wasn't efficiency for the sake of rebuilding civilization. It was efficiency for the sake of control. When people only know one skill, one trade, one role, they become replaceable parts in a machine. And when you're replaceable, you become obedient. At first, the imbalance was subtle. The capital took more than it gave, but just enough trickled back to keep the districts alive, not thriving, just surviving. And survival can be a powerful silencer, enough to quiet dissent for generations. Children were born into this system knowing nothing else. They didn't see the capital as an oppressor. They saw it as reality, as the natural order of things, the way the world just worked. Education reinforced this. History was rewritten and simplified. Concepts like democracy, civil rights, and self-governance were either erased completely or reframed as dangerous failures of the old world. Chaos was blamed on freedom. Collapse was blamed on choice. Order, the capital taught, required sacrifice. And when sacrifice becomes normalized, it stops feeling like an injustice. But the capital's greatest strength wasn't its military or its technology. It was its deep understanding of human psychology. It knew that fear alone is unstable. Too much fear breeds desperation, and desperation leads to rebellion. So, fear had to be balanced with something else. Hope, but not real hope. It was a controlled, manufactured hope. Just enough food to survive another day. Just enough medicine to endure the sickness. Just enough stability to prevent a total collapse. The capital brilliantly positioned itself as both protector and judge. It allowed suffering, but not total ruin. And in doing so, it made itself seem indispensable. As President Snow would later say, hope is stronger than fear. But hope, when carefully measured and doled out, becomes a leash. Nowhere was this delicate balance more fragile than in District 13. Unlike the others, District 13 was never fully integrated into the economic system. It was militarized from the very beginning. Its access to nuclear technology and strategic resources made it too powerful to fully control and too dangerous to openly confront. For a time, District 13 and the capital existed in an uneasy alliance, a relationship built on defense, deterrence, and mutual dependence. But systems built on absolute control cannot tolerate equals. Eventually, the relationship fractured. District 13 went underground, preserving its independence by vanishing from the capital's reach. Officially, it was destroyed, wiped off the map. Unofficially, it became a silent, buried reminder that the capital's control was not absolute. But that reminder was buried deep. For the other districts, District 13 was just a ghost story. Decades passed. The system endured long enough to feel permanent. Long enough to erase memory. Long enough that obedience became a habit rather than a conscious choice born of fear. But then, the pressure started to build. Starvation worsened, resources tightened, and the capital's excess grew more visible, more obscene. Trains loaded with wealth passed through starving districts, carrying riches that would never return. The imbalance was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a lived reality, seen with their own eyes. And slowly, quietly, dissatisfaction began to curdle into awareness. The first uprising, the one later known as the Dark Days, didn't begin as a unified revolution. It started as scattered acts of resistance, small refusals, protests born from hunger, not from ideology. But hunger is a powerful motivator. Several districts rose up, but not all of them. Some districts, those closer to the capital that benefited from military contracts or luxury production, remained loyal. Their survival was tied to the system's continuation. The capital responded with overwhelming force. Advanced weapons, supply cutoffs, information blackouts. The districts were isolated from one another once again, preventing any kind of coordination. The rebellion was crushed not just militarily, but psychologically. District 13 disappeared. The message was clear and terrifying. And then came the Hunger Games. They were never designed as entertainment. Entertainment was just a side effect, a grotesque bonus. Their true purpose was symbolic. It was ritualized punishment, a yearly reminder that rebellion has a price, and that price is your children. By forcing the districts to offer up their own children, the capital transformed the very idea of resistance into trauma. It didn't just punish rebellion, it made people fear the idea of unity itself. The districts were no longer just separated by geography, they were now divided emotionally. Each district was forced to watch the children of others suffer and die, forced to root for their own child to survive at the expense of another's. Unity became impossible. This was psychological warfare perfected. The capital no longer needed a constant military presence in every district. Control had moved inside people's minds. Fear, guilt, and grief did the work far more efficiently than soldiers ever could. For 74 years, the system held. But systems built on enforced dependence are inherently fragile, even when they appear strong. They rely on one central lie above all others, that there is no alternative. Eventually, cracks began to form, not through weapons, but through thought. Questions started to resurface, quietly at first, in whispered conversations. Does order really require fear? Does survival really mean obedience? Is stability worth the cost of freedom? These questions were dangerous, not because they demanded immediate action, but because they reopened the human imagination. And imagination is the ultimate enemy of absolute control. When the capital finally fell, it wasn't because its army vanished or its technology failed. Its surveillance systems were still watching. What it lost was its legitimacy. People no longer believed the system was necessary. They no longer believed obedience was the only path to survival. They remembered, maybe for the first time in generations, that systems are created by people, and anything that can be created can be undone. Panem was not built on a shared vision or a collective will. It emerged from collapse, fear, and desperation. People didn't choose it. They accepted it because they believed they had no other choice. The capital was never elected. It was never agreed upon. It simply filled a vacuum left by a dying world. And that is what made it so powerful and so incredibly dangerous. Because when power disguises itself as salvation, resistance starts to feel like self-destruction. That is the true origin of Panem. It isn't the Hunger Games. It isn't even the rebellion. It's that single moment when humanity mistook survival for submission and forgot that living is more than simply enduring. Thanks for watching. If this look into the psychology of Panem fascinated you, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives. See you next time.